Painting and shading different skin tones is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it no matter your skill level. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools and let's get started. So in this video, I'm going to be working in Procreate, which is an app on the iPad Pro, but you can really follow along using any kind of digital software that you're used to. As long as you have layers, you're totally okay. This is really much more about the technique, not really about any kind of Procreate specific features, so whatever you have is going to work just fine. And this is also a video in which I'm going to really focus on painting the skin and different skin tones and the shading. So if you want to follow along, make sure that you have a base sketch for that. Otherwise, obviously, you can just watch the video to get all the info that you can then apply to whichever illustration you're working on. And if you're looking for a base sketch tutorial, just how to draw a face, I have a few that you can watch. I have a more cartoon version, so super cutesy kind of style, and I also have a more realistic portrait drawing video. So I'll link those in the description below so you can check them out if you want to follow along. Just make sure that, again, you have your sketch ready and we're going to jump in. Now in this video, I'm going to be using this base sketch here. If you want a tutorial on how to draw this specific character, just let me know in the comments below, and if I get enough requests, I will do it. But for now, you can really use whatever you have. It's the same technique no matter which base sketch you are using. And in terms of colors, it is always helpful to have either a color reference in terms of you have a picture that you can, color pick the base color from, or if you have a color palette that you either created yourself or got from online. I'm going to tell you about it later. You don't have to agonize over the color. You just want to roughly have an idea of the ballpark of the colors you might want to use. So the first thing we're going to do here is quite simple. We're going to start by just mapping out the base shape of the face. So for that, I obviously like to create a new layer that I put below the sketch, so that way I can still see the sketch and not paint over it. And on this layer, we're going to really just draw a solid color. So just one color that's going to be the same everywhere. And for that, honestly, you can use really any kind of base round brush that you have. So the most basic brush you can find in your software, that's what I would use if I were you. And here, all you have to do really is outline the shape of the face or the body if you're drawing a full body, and then fill in this outline. And at this stage, you're going to pick a color that you think is going to work well, but it really doesn't have to be exactly the one you're going to use later. Now, the thing I really like about digital art is it's so flexible. So you can just pick something that roughly resembles a skin tone, paint that, fill that in, and later in the process, as we move on, as we add some secondary colors, some shading, some highlights, that's when you can go in and refine the color you picked first super easily and quickly. So for now, just paint with something that kind of feels like skin, and that's more than enough at this stage. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about different kind of skin tones, especially darker skin tones, because I know a lot of people are a little bit afraid of painting darker skin tones. It can look really kind of ashy very quickly, but it's really, when you use this technique, it's pretty much the same for all skin tones. We're just going to be tweaking a few things. So for now, I'm going to start with a fairly, I guess, kind of medium skin tone, and later in the video I'm going to show you how we would adapt that for a darker skin tone, or a few considerations that you need to keep in mind for darker skin tones. So super simple. But again, yeah, for now I'm just gonna go with a paler skin tone, but feel free to go ahead with dark to start. Now, one thing that is really important when we're drawing portraits is, well, characters or faces or skin, I should say, is that we need to understand that the skin is not just one flat color like we have right now. There are different parts of the skin that have different kind of, I guess, thickness, and that are going to show the blood behind it more or less. And that is especially true on a lighter skin tone. In general, the darker the skin, the less see-through it's going to be. So in order to show the different kind of colors that we have in the face and make the face feel more alive and just more interesting in general, what we're going to do is we are going to paint some crazy bold colors over our face. And for that, we're going to create a new layer, which is going to allow us later to play with the opacity as well as blending modes until we get something that we like and doesn't look quite as crazy as what we're about to do. And we might also want to apply this new layer as a clipping mask so that everything we draw on this new layer is going to stay within the base shape that we already spent a few minutes working on. So you can just apply, like I was saying, the clipping mask, and we're going to start with a super vibrant kind of raspberry red pink color. And right now it's going to look crazy, believe me, it's totally fine, but we are going to just paint that over this part of the character. And for that, again, the brush really is not that important. Here you could use a super soft brush, so again, just like an airbrushing brush that comes with literally any kind of digital art software of your choice. If you like working with textures a little bit more, you could go with a pencil or charcoal kind of brush. Here I'm gonna go with my basic texture brush, which comes with my illustration bundle. I mean, again, I'm not really gonna talk that much about brushes here in this video, but if you want to check out my illustration bundle, it will be linked in the description below. There's always a special promo code for the YouTube people, but seriously, here, this is really not the point. We're not worried about brushes. So the first colors we want to apply are, well, the first color we want to work with, I should say, is a super bright, vibrant pink or red for all of this kind of cheek, nose area. So think of where you would apply blush. You know, when you're working with makeup, you try to kind of put this emphasis on this region here, the top of the cheeks and maybe a little bit of the bridge of the nose as well, because we're trying to mimic the kind of the blood flow that we took away by putting foundation on our face. So this is the same thing we're doing here. Essentially, we're just bringing some blood back in the face. Now, again, like I was saying, if you're working with a darker skin tone, you would not see that as much, but the lighter the skin is, the more you need to bring back some of that blood in the cheeks, the top of the nose. It might also go on the top of the ears, maybe as well if you're seeing the shoulders, you might have a little bit of red there. So that makes a big difference. Now this reddish pink is probably the most important colors, but we're going to go a little bit further by adding some yellow on top of the forehead, which I know sounds crazy, but wait until you hear the next one. So this yellow, I personally like to go and color pick the color of the skin, the base, and just make it a little bit more yellow and maybe a bit brighter. And you just kind of color it really roughly over the forehead. We're also going to be adding some blue, yes, blue, around the chin area. And this one, I know it sounds really crazy and it's going to look absolutely insane when we start painting it. You can see it's just so strange. But it does make a big difference when we start lowering the opacity of this layer. It really blends in really nicely and makes the face feel much more alive. Now, this blue, I would not recommend adding it to darker skin tones because it makes it look super gray and ashy, and we don't want that. So just for paler to medium skin tones, this blue, super important. Now for the eyelids, depending on how realistic your character is, you might want to add a little bit of purple, maybe even some green or teal or blue colors, again on the top of the eyes, maybe a little bit here as well, and on the bottom corner. But if you're drawing a super cartoonish character that has big round eyes, don't do that. Otherwise your character is going to look sick or tired, just not good. So just for semi-realistic to realistic characters, you might want to add again a little bit more of a cooler tone around the eyes. So once you have that done, you can go ahead and play with the opacity so that it doesn't look quite as clownish as it does right now. So yeah, just kind of, there's not a magic number here. It really depends on the base color you have for the base skin, as well as the intensity of the colors you use on your color variation layer. So you can play with the opacity, putting it quite low, as you're going to see, like 10% or something like that. And you can also experiment with different blending modes, especially depending on well, you can play with different blending modes depending on the base color as well. So you're going to find, for example, one base color, you're going to use the blending more normal. Then maybe with a darker skin tone, you might want to use something like overlay or soft light or even color or hue. So here again, it's really not a one size fits all. The technique is the same in the sense that you're going to draw these crazy colors, but then in terms of blending them with the base, you just go ahead, go through the list and experiment. Now, if you don't have blending mode in your digital art software, don't worry about it. Just play with opacity, and that's honestly more than enough. So now that we have this less flat base, but still very flat in terms of there's no volume in it at all, we can move on to adding some shadows. So for that, I also like to create a new layer that I also apply as a clipping mask so that my shadows stay within the base shape that we worked on. And for the shadows, I like to work with the blending mode, linear burn, or multiply. These both work really, really well for shading in general. It's just a question of personal preference, and I kind of use one or the other depending on what I'm feeling that day. So for now, I'm going to use multiply, and I like to lower the opacity to start around 50% and then go back in later and kind of tweak that. And in terms of color for your shadow, you have so many different options. The only thing I would suggest is you try to avoid something that is neutral like gray or black, because as you can see, it looks super muddy and boring. So try to get shadows that are cooler tones to pinkish tones. So, it can still be a little bit grayish and not just super bright purple, but a little bit more of a tint to your gray. And you can see now that it looks much warmer and much richer and just so much better overall. So shadows can be intimidating, especially for faces, especially if you're going for semi-realistic to realistic. But I really think if you find a reference online, everything's going to be easier. So don't be afraid to go online and look at pictures of like mapping the shadows on the face and stuff like that. You can also go ahead and create just a random scratch layer, draw your light source, and draw a bunch of rays if you want to create your own light situation. So that way you always have a reminder of what the light is hitting if you don't want to work with a reference. So once you have that, going back on your shadow layer, it's quite easy. You can just follow the light source, follow one ray, and see, okay, so for example, this ray is going to be hitting the face like this, which means it's going to create a shadow, like the chin is going to cast a shadow on the neck. That's actually pretty much similar to what I have going on right now on my face, so that's helpful. The ray is also hitting here the hair, so the hair is casting a very small shadow on the side of the face. This is not necessarily super realistic, as you can see here, like the hair is not as big as what it is in the illustration. But again, it's an illustration, so we have a little bit more room to experiment and play with crazy shadows. So you can really start with just going around your illustration, following the rays and seeing what it's hitting and what kind of shadow it's casting. So the nose, you're going to have a shadow there as well. You might want to just kind of reel it in a little bit with the nose though, because if it is a big shadow like it would be realistically here, it's just going to look crazy on the cartoon illustration. So just keeping it, you want to make it, you want to draw it so it's there, but really, really subtle. The more cartoonish it is, the more subtle the nose shadow should be, basically. But you're also going to be getting some form shadows. So you can see here, there's nothing that is going to cast a shadow on the side of the face. I'm pointing in my face and then I have a light on the side, but in the illustration here, for example, there's nothing that is casting a shadow on the side of the face, but the light is not, cannot reach the side as much because the face has a form, it's not just flat, so it's curving away. So you're going to also be drawing some softer shadows in the areas where the face is curving away. So you're going to have probably shadows around the bottom of the face, like the cheeks and stuff like that, probably around the shoulders as well. Again, depending on your light source, usually it's going to be focused on the side that is opposite to your light source or scores. So just kind of roughly mapping out some form shadows as well so that your character doesn't look quite as flat. And again, here, don't be afraid. Please, by all means, go ahead and either look at your face. You can take a picture of your own face in a specific light scenario, or go on Pinterest and look at different kind of lighting situations. So reference are your best friend in terms of shading. You just need to figure out roughly where the shadows and lights are, and then just using this basic technique to map them out on your character. So once you've roughly mapped out your shadows, you can go back and play with the opacity of both the color variation layer and the shadow layer to kind of have them interact a little bit better together. And you can also go back in and add some difference in your shadows, because right now we painted all the shadow with one color, which could work, but it might be a little bit interesting to go back in with a darker version of your color, maybe a version of your color that is a little bit cooler, so adding more blue in your color. If it's pink, it's going to be more purple. If it's purple to start with, it's going to be more blue. So making it a little bit cooler, a little bit darker, and then going back in the areas where you have cast shadow to make those more intense. So around the neck, probably around the hairline, maybe a little bit around the nostrils. Again, not this crazy bridge of the nose. Don't do that. It's going to look absolutely insane, but maybe around the nostrils, maybe a little bit around the ears as well. So just experimenting with different version of your shadow color to make them a little bit more richer and a little bit more interesting. Especially if you're working on a piece that is semi-realistic or realistic, you want to make sure that you have some variety in your colors and your shadows. Otherwise, it's going to look quite flat. If you're working with something super cartoonish, then you have a little bit more freedom in the sense that you don't have to add as much color variation, I think. But it's always good to do, and it doesn't take super long. It's just changing the color a little bit and then going over some accent areas. So it's totally okay, I think, when you're creating your shadow first to really roughly map them out, and then going in with something like a smudge tool, which is usually a finger icon. You could use a smudge tool with a super soft brush, like the soft brush from Procreate. I personally like to use the stucco brush that is in the painting panel of Procreate. It kind of has a little bit of a charcoal feel, and I like to use it because it retains some of the texture and adds some of the texture so that the skin doesn't look quite as polished and kind of plasticky. I want my skin to have a little bit of texture. And with the smudge tool, you can go around and smooth in the form shadows. So form shadows usually, again, that's kind of a rule of thumb, it's not the truth in all light situations, but usually form shadows tend to be a little bit smoother. They tend to create a soft gradient. You can kind of see here on my cheek. It's not a harsh line, but shadows that are created by a cast shadow, so the light hitting something and then the object casting a shadow on something else, like here, my face or my head on my neck. You can see the line on this shadow is much sharper than the line on my cheek. So you're gonna go in and blur, well, not blur, but kind of smooth, I should say, your form shadows on your character, making sure that you leave the edges of the cast shadows harder, yes. So the edges of your cast shadow should remain very crisp and clear. And that way, having some variation in the sharpness, I should say, of your shadows, that's going to make a big difference in the final result, as if you were just going to smooth everything in and blend everything in the same. It's going to look much better if you do have some of that variation. So experiment with that. And one thing that I really like, again, like I was saying with digital art, is it's so flexible. I personally don't worry as much about the color when I'm picking them first. I just pick a color that I know is roughly what I want in that moment. And then once I'm done painting the bulk of it, I use a tool that is called the Hue Saturation Brightness. Now, Hue Saturation Brightness is available in most digital art software. If you don't have it, you could go with something like, Color Balance or something like that. Anything that allows you to change the color. You can always use that and play with the settings to see if there's a slightly different version of the color that you pick that you like better. So I always do that with my shadows. I go back in, use the Hue Saturation and Brightness tool to see if a different hue or different saturation of my shadow might blend it better with the base that I picked. And once you're happy with the rough shadow that you placed, we can always tweak it later. For now, just roughly place them. We're going to move on to adding highlights, which is really going to bring the face to life. So I like to create a new layer, apply it as a clipping mask as well. And for the highlights, I like to use the blending mode add. Add is very, very strong, so you might lead to lowered opacity quite a lot. I start usually around 40% or something like that. And the highlights, I tend to use a super, super vibrant or bright, I should say, yellow, orangish color. I like to mimic the sun, the color of the sun, basically. And here are the highlights. I like to go with a super stylized kind of painting. So if you were to look at my face, for example, for now, the highlights are super smooth and blended, except for my nose here. But on my characters, I always draw very, very shiny highlights. So they're not blended at all. They're super precise and kind of focused around different areas of the face, mostly the cheeks, the nose, a little bit above the eyes, maybe even the corner of the mouths. Some super cartoonish highlights on the ears and the shoulders as well. So it's mostly like the character is almost shiny at this point. So highlights here, it's really a place where you can experiment with your own style and show a lot of your own art style. So you could have very blended highlights or super sharp, precise, cartoonish highlights like I have. So yeah, again, here, just look at the placement of the lights on your reference if you have a reference. Otherwise, you can reactivate your little light source sketch and see where the light is hitting the face in which area and place the highlights there. If you want a more smoothed highlighting look, you can also use the smudge tool here to blend them in a little bit. But like I was saying, I don't really do that on mine. I just like to have super crazy, sharp, precise, reflection almost on my character. Speaking of reflection, we also do have some sort of, well, reflection, not some sort. We do have some reflection on the skin because the skin does have some oil, so that, reflects light. So we're going to create a new layer once we're done with the highlights, or roughly done with the highlights. This one is also going to be a clipping mask. This one is going to be for the reflected lights. So in terms of blending mode here, I like to use either overlay or soft light. Now, this is a part where the skin tone really does matter because pale skin tones really don't reflect the light quite as much as dark skin tone. Dark skin tones, we don't see a lot of the blood colors, but we do see a lot of the reflection. So depending on the skin tone you're working with, you're going to have different intensity of reflected light. Now, reflected lights are going to also vary in terms of color based on where your character is. So here I'm pretending that character is outside, which means the reflected light would be kind of the blue from the sky. And these reflected light usually are on all the planes that are hitting towards, well, facing towards the top. So kind of the forehead, probably the bridge of the nose, the top of the cheeks as well. All this area, maybe the shoulders as well if you have them in your character. All these areas are going to be, they're going to show a little bit of reflected light. Now, like I was saying here, the reflected light, the intensity of it really depends on the skin tone. So here, since I'm drawing kind of a medium skin tone, I want my reflected lights to be fairly light. You could also just kind of skip it, honestly, for this skin tone. But it is really, really important for darker skins. I'm going to show you that later. I'm just kind of getting ahead of myself. But yeah, so once you have your base lights, or reflected lights, I should say, and highlights and shadows, once all of that is roughly mapped out, this is the time where you would go in and refine them. And by refine them, I mean not just repaint them, but also just play with opacity, change the blending modes, and see what works well with your base skin tone. So really, that's the key. When drawing different skin tones, painting skin, you want to use these same steps, so including, color variation, shadows, highlights, reflected lights. That is never going to change. What is going to change is, well, the base color that you use for your base, face shape. But everything else, what is going to change is just the way the layers blend together and the intensity of each layer. So again, pale skin, you're going to have very intense, more intense color variation, so the blood is going to be more visible because the skin, since it's lighter, you can kind of see through it a little bit better. It's almost transparent in a way, but you're gonna get less reflection, so less kind of the blue reflected light. But the darker the skin gets, the less see-through it is, so the less of that color variation you're going to see, but the more of the reflected light you're going to have. So keep that in mind, and that's really the main recipe in creating different skin tone. It's just experimenting with the different intensity of the different layers that we have going on right now. Now, like I was saying earlier, this video is really not about drawing all the different facial features and all the details on like the eyes and stuff like that. So I'm gonna just really quickly paint them. But again, if you want me to do a tutorial on step-by-step how to both sketch this character and draw the other features, not really focusing on the skin tones quite as much, just leave me a comment below, and if there's enough requests, I will do it. But while I'm painting this, I'm going to use this time for the secret password. So if you've watched this final video, please go ahead and leave a comment with the word skin tones. Now, I know if you're new on the channel, you might be like, what's the deal with the secret password? Like, what is that all about? Well, we've been doing this for a few months, and it is really cool for a few reasons. Honestly, one of them is that it gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you guys, which is what we all want in the end, isn't it? But it's also really cool because you guys know me, you see my face, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you guys are. And whenever you leave a comment with whatever you comment, honestly, I get to see sometimes your name, sometimes your face, and yeah, it's just super cool to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on this channel. So just leave a comment with the word skin tones, and then we're going to keep going. I'm actually going to be telling you about how to draw different skin tones or how to change the skin tone if you already have something that you sketch and want to kind of play with it a little bit more. So let's talk about skin tones. So here we're going to do a fun little experiment in which we're going to take this sketch that this illustration that we have. I'm going to group all of my layers, and then we're going to duplicate the group, and we're going to look at how to get darker skin tones and what that entails, and also how you can maybe tweak a skin tone that you already have painted on your character. So the first thing I personally do when I want to change a skin tone is go back to the base layer, obviously, and go back in the adjustment panel using the hue, saturation, and brightness tool. I go ahead and I experiment and try to find a skin tone that I prefer. So here I'm going to try to find something darker. On camera right now it looks so burnt orange, but eventually, bear with me, I promise it's gonna look a little bit better. So you could also use a color fill. So if you have, for example, the swatch or the hex code that you want to use for your base skin tone, you could just import that and recolor your entire base using either the color drop or the paint bucket or something like that. Now, once you change your base color, all you have to do really is go and play with the opacity and the blending modes of all the other layers that we have. So here, for example, we see that this base that we changed is now darker than the original, which means the color variation layer is going to have to be way paler with a different, softer blending mode. So in my case here, I'm really going way down with the opacity, and I'm also erasing the blue that we had on the bottom of the face, because like I was saying when we were painting that, the blue doesn't look super good with darker skin tones, and that was a super good example of that. It didn't look good at all. So you can always just go back and erase some color variation that just doesn't blend as well with the color variation or with the base skin tone that you were using at this point. You also can change the hue of the shadows. For darker skin tones, I tend to go with more brown or rusty shadow colors as opposed to pinkish and bluish. Otherwise, it can kind of interact and look ashy, which is what we were trying to avoid. And same with the highlights. You might want to just change the hue or simply play with the opacity. I tend to keep the same blending mode for the highlights, so I tend to keep add. I just think it works really, really well with most skin tones. But again, feel free to experiment here. In general, I find that the highlights when using add though on dark skin tones, you're really going to need to reel that in and lower the opacity, because add works so much more intensely on darker colors. So you just need to lower the opacity for that. And same thing with reflected lights. Here, reflected lights are a little bit tricky because, like I was saying, they show up more on darker skin tones, but it's really quite tricky to get the right color that doesn't make it look again, ashy. So here you might spend a good deal of time if you're working with darker skin tone. You might spend a lot of time tweaking your hue, saturation, brightness sliders, playing with the opacity, playing with the different kind of blending mode. You might also want to go in, and if you were using a brush that was textured, you might want to go in and blend or smooth your reflected light layer so that it doesn't look quite as textury. Textury, is that a word? It's going to be a word for now. Sorry, there's a motorcycle outside apparently. But yeah, so finding the way to have nice reflected light without them looking crazy. And now I'm looking at what my camera picked up when I was filming, and it looks a little bit crazy. So I could have made that opacity a little bit lower for this character. Now, the last thing you might want to do if you're changing the base color of your skin tone later in the process is also going back and changing, for example, the lips. So I draw always the lips on a separate layer so that I can quickly change the color. Same thing with like the hair, maybe the eyes. You just want to make sure that everything works together really, really well. So again, it's not complicated. Playing with skin tones should be a lot of fun because you don't have to get it right. You can just experiment, and at one point you're going to find something that you like. So it shouldn't be this terrifying thing of, oh no, I don't know which color to start with. Just pick any color. Honestly, you could start with green, do the entire process, and once you have your shadows, your color variation, your highlights, your reflected light, just going back and changing your green to something that looks more like skin. So seriously here, don't be afraid of skin tones. Play with it. There's a billion combinations that you can use of blending modes, opacity, base colors, and you just need to find the one that you like the most for this specific character and then just run with it. So here I'm just going to quickly put the two characters side by side so you're going to see the difference in the skin tone, and you're going to see how, I mean, so different, but it's the exact same technique. Again, we're just changing the way the different layers are interacting together. So quite simple, and I could go back in, for example, make this base even lighter, less saturated. I could go with a crazy color like a avatar kind of character, blue. Could go with green, Shrekish little character. So this technique worked for any kind of skin tone. Again, I'm repeating myself. All you have to do is just play with the different layers, and that's it. It's really not harder than that. Now again, like I was saying, if you want a video in which I teach you how to draw this specific face, please leave me a comment below, and if I get enough requests, I will for sure do a tutorial about it. But otherwise, if you want to learn how to draw more stuff related to the face, so the proportions of the face, maybe lips, the eyes, stuff like that, I highly recommend you check out this playlist in which I'm going to teach you exactly that. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here, and I'll meet you there.